Hi class, I'm Dr. Howard.
We're going to record this for the other classes, so chillax, put your stuff down, and Julie's going to tell you about studying this stuff as a real scientist. You ready to start?
Anytime.
Okay, let's just do it.
Well, my laboratory studies basically adaptations to the environment, and we generally focus on things like animal behavior, physiology, life history strategies, and try to understand how organisms use different ways of coping with their environment and how it helps them succeed. So one of the species that we study, we're equal opportunity offenders. We study plants, we study animals, we study insects, although insects are animals. One of the species that we study is called Chinese tallow tree, and it's an invasive species, and it's really interesting why it's invasive. So we spent a lot of time trying to understand how it got here, and why it spreads so quickly, and relevant to our talk today, what its effect on the environment is. So Chinese tallow tree came, not surprisingly, from South China. It's a temperate tree, and it does very well in warm temperate climates like Louisiana. And it has some very interesting characteristics. It has this sticky latex sap that makes it very difficult for things to eat. So most plants will acquire insects that will eat them very quickly, but Chinese tallow tree did not. So Chinese tallow tree has escaped from its natural enemies by coming to the United States, courtesy of people like us. And although it was originally imported because they thought they could use the seeds to make wax for the candle industry, it promptly escaped from cultivation and has been growing wild in the southern United States for upwards of 150 years now. And it has some very nasty properties. Because it's hard to eat, a lot of insects avoid it. And so in comparison with native vegetation, it's a biological desert out there. If you have a stand of Chinese tallow trees, there won't be insects in there. The only insects that you'll find are the insects that are there pollinating the flowers at certain times of year. But nothing is eating the leaves. And that means that for nesting birds, there's nothing for them to eat. And so that's been well established for a very long time. What we wanted to do in our lab when we started looking at that tree is figure out what the impact of the tree is on soil arthropods. So the large insects, and sometimes the smaller insects that start the decomposition process. Because one of the critical things in ecology about the way that ecosystems work is that organisms have nutrients, and when they die, those nutrients have to be turned back into the soil and become available to other organisms. And that process is really critical. If you disturb it, then you can profoundly disturb the entire community. So we understood that Chinese tallow tree had a lot of impacts on things like birds. We wanted to know if it had impacts on soil arthropods, and if it did have impacts on soil arthropods, what the impacts were on things that eat them, like little salamanders or lizards or snakes or little mice and things like that. And so we had to devise a way to sample the soil insect community, and not surprisingly, it has something to do with something like this. Ecology is very high-tech, and this was our high-tech innovation for sampling the soil community. Basically what we did was go to areas in Bayou Sauvage National Wildlife Refuge, about 30 miles from here, where there were lots of tallow trees in monospecific stands, so that they had more or less taken over and crowded out all the native vegetation. And we looked for areas where they were just invading, so there were still native trees, but with an understory of Chinese tallows. And then sites that had very few tallow trees at all, that were almost exclusively native vegetation. And in order to sample the soil community, we dug holes in the soil, we put our high-tech traps down there, and we walked away. And we went back after a few days and collected what was in here. And of course, if you're going to collect something in Louisiana for more than a day or two, you have to preserve it some way. So we used a little alcohol to do that. And we then used an equally high-tech innovation, sandwich bags. We poured the contents into the sandwich bags, took them back to the laboratory, and then we spent a year and a half looking at the samples under the microscope. Because there were a lot of little bugs in there, over 117,000 individual bugs. And a graduate student identified them all. And you can help if you would like to after you do this lab. So here's the results, and we have hundreds of these, and they are filled with little insects. And we were able to determine what the impact of Chinese tallow trees was on the soil arthropods then by counting them and identifying them to species and comparing sites that were heavily invaded, sites that had just been invaded, and sites that were untouched. So interestingly enough, the spiders were heavily affected by the presence of Chinese tallow tree. They're top predators in the soil community. So large vertebrates, well, salamanders and lizards will eat spiders. However, spiders are the top predators among the invertebrates. So there were fewer spiders in areas where there were lots of Chinese tallow trees. There were also fewer predatory beetles in areas where there were lots of tallow trees. It was a little harder to see the effects on overall species diversity, because what happened was not that species dropped out altogether, the composition changed. So we had some species that were common in areas that had Chinese tallow, some that were common in areas that did not have Chinese tallow, and they were different species in general. The big difference, as it turns out, was the timing and the total abundance of the invertebrates. Chinese tallow trees have this very flimsy leaf that when it falls in November, it decays within about 6 weeks, and then it's gone. So they put a pulse of nutrients into the soil very quickly, then that goes away, and it more or less washes out as the winter rains flood the soil. So those nutrients aren't there for animals after about mid-December. And what we found was the insect availability followed that pulse. There were a lot of insects available, and they were different species than the ones in the uninvaded areas, but only during the early part of winter. And later on in early spring, when the native vegetation was still putting out leaves that were still decaying, had not finished releasing their nutrients into the soil, that's when they had their peak abundance. And as it turns out, what's different about Chinese tallow stands is not that they are bad for insects, it's that they only provide food for soil insects during a very limited time of the year. So there's a pulse, and then there's a drop-off, and then the rest of the year it's a desert. And there's literally nothing for the small vertebrates to eat. So Chinese tallow tree does have an impact on these small vertebrates. It's not that nothing can eat the leaves that fall from the trees, it's that they're only available for a limited time of year, and that affects the ability of those larger animals to maintain themselves over an entire year. They either die for lack of food, or they have to leave the area. If they leave the area, they go to areas where there is food, but there are also other animals already there. So it's a general increase in the intensity of competition for those animals, and lots of them probably either reproduce poorly or maybe die outright. And we are pretty confident that this has a big impact on the overall food chain. So if we have fewer small vertebrates, we'll have fewer medium vertebrates. And that means that things like raccoons or wild hogs that would prey on the small animals, they're also not there. So this is another way in which Chinese tallow tree has an impact on natural communities. And we would not know that unless we had these very innovative ways of sampling the invertebrate community. But this whole issue really should make you think about, how do we know what species are present in an area? And how do we sample them? For little insects in the soil, we can use this method. For birds, you'll have to use different methods altogether. For plants, fortunately they can't move. It's easier in some ways. You'll have to use a different set of measurements. But not only does studying insects give you some insights into the biological diversity of life on Earth, it also should make you think a little bit about how we know what we know. And if you're ever interested in earning some research credit after you finish the sophomore core courses, you can come and see me and I'll put you to work going through some of these samples, which we still have after a number of years. And they have not been completely identified to the point where we can publish the data just yet. So you could make a contribution to publication. So, questions? No questions.
Yep.